All right. So while John's getting the live stream going, hopefully you guys have gotten these cards to invite friends for the Sunday services. And then I made up flyers for our next 4-week series on Christian apologetics. So they're out front if you need extra copies to hand out to a friend. You want to invite somebody that's been a little bit of a skeptic, or maybe somebody that has more questions than you're comfortable answering. We'll try and tackle some of those. So Colin obviously outlined really well the kind of case for why the resurrection matters. And hopefully you were all able to find seats, depending on what service you came to yesterday. It was a packed house. But he was right. If you don't understand Easter, you don't understand Jesus, you don't understand the why. And I think obviously when you start thinking about the Old Testament and what we've seen already through Genesis, you realize there's this pretty consistent drumbeat of the sacrifice to come. And that is the meta theme kind of the entirety of the Old Testament, punctuated obviously by the mistakes of individuals in the nation of Israel, at least twice going to captivity. And so I'm going to focus today really on why I think it's not just a tale, it's truth. And hopefully give you guys some points that if you're in a conversation where somebody is operating from either old or incomplete data, you're able to speak to it. There was a point kind of during the Jesus movement and really the 40s through early 70s where there was a lot of critique. Was there even a historical Jesus? At that time, we had not discovered some of the ancient historian writings. You know, there was a lot of idea that was legend. And so we'll talk more about that. And at the end of the day, Paul himself says, if Christ is not risen, we are to be pitied amongst men. You know, that there is an emptiness to Christianity without a living, risen Christ. And so, I want us to think about, and this is going to be true for the next 4 weeks as well, 1 Peter 3:15. But in your hearts, honor Christ, the Lord is holy. Always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. You know, we're going to talk about a lot of intellectual information. It isn't meant to be a baseball bat, but it is meant to be able to speak the truth in love and to bring somebody along that has genuine questions. At the end of the day, there still is a faith component to this. I can't show you a videotape of the risen Christ, at least not yet. With AI generation, who knows what will come, but authentic one doesn't exist. But for myself and a lot of you've experienced God personally. You've sensed his presence. You've seen him perform miracles in your life or the life of someone close to you. And so we have evidence in the modern period as well, but I think there's a lot of historical evidence that if we look at modern scholarship, there's a couple of things we're going to see. And so to keep you from getting writer's cramp, we do have front and back notes today. I printed some of these so that you're not having to scribble madly, and you can go back and refer to them later. But I think there's 12 things that support a bodily resurrection. We'll dive into some of these as we go. But one, there was an empty tomb. Ironically, even the Jewish leaders at the time said the disciples stole the body. They didn't dispute that the body was not in the tomb. So you have to explain that somehow. Jesus had post-mortem appearances. There are some that have critiqued and said, it was just some ethereal vision, given that he did walk and eat and talk. When we think about doubting Thomas putting his hands in the wounds, this couldn't have been some ghostly specter. There had to be a physical, tangible quality to Christ for that to be true. And I think it's really important to understand there was a very short time frame between when the death and resurrection of Christ occurred and when our earliest eyewitness claims and some of the earliest Gospels were written. It was also very geographically situated in Jerusalem. It would have been very tough to go around Jerusalem convincing people that Christ had been resurrected if anybody could have said to the contrary, no, I saw the body somewhere. And we'll look into this in a little more detail, but some of the more modern critiques and maybe the extreme of maybe a Da Vinci Code have tried to argue, the Gospels were written hundreds of years later. This can't possibly be authentic. What's ironic is they're actually usually referencing some of the apocryphal Gospels that no credible Christian accepts as part of the canon of Scripture. But of the Matthew, Mark, Luke, Luke, and John, the synoptic gospels, those have a very concreteness, and Mark, as we'll look at some of my arguments for why it's early dated, is very contemporary. We see obviously in Acts 2 with Pentecost, a massive conversion of people that it seems to have stuck, that in spite of their preconceived notions as Jews, that they would have seen this as apostasy, the teaching, they became convinced that it was true, and it had to have been due to those eyewitness accounts and their firsthand experience with the Holy Spirit. I think one of the other things to me that's significant is the transformation not only of the apostles, but of James and Jude, half-brothers. And for any of you that have siblings, imagine the conversation, no, really, I'm God, and how that would go. And we see, James even says, let's go take him away, he's mentally ill. The earlier gospel account is James was not on board with him being the risen Christ or God until after the resurrection. And Jude, also a half-brother, so to convince two of your siblings that you in fact are the resurrected Christ, and both of them willing to die for that understanding is significant. We go from Peter obviously denying Christ, the apostles scattering, to now coming and speaking boldly, and all, as we'll see, but John dying for that belief. I think one of the greatest religious conversions ever has to be Paul, Saul to Paul, where he's persecuting the church, he's imprisoning, he's killing Christians. He has a order from the Sanhedrin to exterminate Christians. That's a pretty significant swing. There is the emergence of a historic Christian church. Both Jewish and Roman leaders for the first several centuries of Christianity were opposed and took extreme measures from imprisonment to death, stoning, crucifixion, feeding to wild animals, using them as human torches. There was a brutal, savage oppression. The fact that it survived that is very unique in human history, and I think has to be explained. Either you saw a generational mass hysteria hallucination, or the early church continued to see not only eyewitness accounts, but they themselves experienced Christ in a resurrected relational capacity, and the change that comes with that. I think another one that's not commonly talked about is the move of the Sabbath from Friday night to Saturday evening to Sunday. The idea that this was heavily Jews initially, that they would change their day of worship almost pre-requires this sense that something really different happened Easter Sunday morning. To change, rough math, 6,000 years at least of recorded generational history, plus whatever took place during creation. I think we see lots of early references to Jesus' resurrection and the Pauline epistles or Apostle Paul's letters. We also see that the New Testament accounts of Jesus' resurrection not resemble later apocryphal accounts. Like Mark is pretty simple, and it stops actually at the women seeing the empty tomb and going away, bewildered. Other gospels go a little farther, but none of them have this flavor of like a Gospel of Thomas or some of the other apocryphal writings that have these flourishes and talk about the soldiers and, the color and all these added details that are very different than what would seem to be legitimate firsthand accounts, probably oral tradition for at least several years. Another critical one is there's no tomb that's ever been venerated as the place of Jesus. We think about other historical figures. We know where their graves are. Some are in big cathedrals or big monuments, or, even the one that's reputedly Christopher Columbus is this massive marble structure. There's no such thing for Jesus. There's two, obviously, empty tomb sites that are uncertain whether they're authentic, but there's nowhere we can point that says, here's the tomb, here lies Jesus. Or, even Lazarus was raised from the dead, but then he died again. We can see his ultimate tomb. I think that it's also important to understand from a Jewish view on death. And Christ is pretty critical of some of the Pharisees. You whitewash sepulchres filled with dead men's bone. That was a pretty harsh slap across the face. It was deemed to be so unpure, unclean, that a crucified Messiah would never have taken any traction in a Jewish mindset. They would have viewed it actually as cursed or defiled, not anything to be deified or glorified. And ultimately, I think all the naturalistic explanations fail, and we'll look at some of those as we go in. But that's kind of at a high level where I think some of the most compelling cases are, either logically or historically. Any questions on any of those? Because we're going to make your head hurt by the time we're done. Should have brought the bottle of Excedrin. I think it's also important to note, if you look at even secular historians and even several atheist historians, there's 4 pretty universally accepted facts around this. One is that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. You know, a former member of the Sanhedrin, well, he was a member of the Sanhedrin at the time, wasn't there for the vote. That on the 3rd day, the tomb was discovered empty by a group of women. That there were post-mortem appearances of Jesus to many different groups of people. And that the disciples suddenly and permanently became convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead. Those, I think, are fairly universally accepted premises. Now, the question, obviously, is what's the most logical conclusion from those facts? You know, I think the most common critique, and the one that was contemporary at the time of Jewish leaders, was the disciples stole the body. I think that's very problematic to then say that, well, the disciples would have believed this to the point of death and martyrdom if it was all some concocted grand conspiracy. And I think there's also a massive question behind that. Why? Well, what's the upside? What was the massive gain? Because these guys all basically got pushed to the 4 corners of the earth with nothing. I mean, this wasn't some grand power grab or money grab or things that you might say were natural motivations. It is interesting because, as I mentioned, 60, 70 years ago, there was a lot of critique around, whether Christ was in fact even a historic person or surely simply legend. And I think as we've continued to discover more and more both archaeological sites and early papyrus records, it's becoming clearer and clearer that these kind of basic tenets were found in North Africa, in Italy, in parts of Europe, that they were spread very rapidly by the 1st century conclusion, 90-ish AD, called 60-ish years from the crucifixion. It had spread widely. This wasn't some legendary event that was recorded hundreds of years later and embellished. For the crucifixion, there's pretty much unanimous evidence that a crucifixion of Christ took place. Both the Roman historian Josephus, who was Jewish by upbringing, so was biased against Christianity, Tacitus and Suetonius, all wrote pretty early, 30, 40, 50 years within the death of Christ in reference of crucifixion. Josephus even recognizes the disciples argued that he had been resurrected. He didn't believe it personally, but that's true. The Jewish Talmud and rabbinical records indicate that there was a crucifixion, and in their account, the disciples stole the body, which again then kind of is compelling towards, well, then the tomb was empty, because otherwise they would have produced the body if they'd found it. Obviously, you have Bible and first-hand accounts, and even the Quran addresses it. Now, it claims that he lived through the experience, kind of the swoon theory. No contemporary scholar believes that's true, that the Romans didn't know the difference between alive and dead. Crucifixion happened a lot in the Roman Empire. They had a pretty darn good idea of alive and dead. And obviously the gospel account of being pierced by a spear is a pretty clear indicator they wanted to make sure dead was dead. This was a special step taken in the case of Christ because they wanted to make sure. And at the end of the day, sadly and maybe tragically, the Romans did know how to beat and kill people. I mean, when he gets 39 lashes, he was not doing well to start out. This was not, Christ at his physical best going onto the cross, let alone the process of crucifixion. And at the end of the day, legionnaires risked their own lives if they were ultimately determined to be negligent in their duties and didn't make sure someone was dead post-crucifixion. In fact, there's even a Latin term that was phrased, our modern word excruciating means out of the cross. And so a new word was even brought up that said crucifixion was not the pleasant way to go. There was a pretty clear path in this process, and it led to painful, prolonged death, not anything other than that. And there's no other, any other historical reference of someone surviving a crucifixion, playing dead, and then running around later. Looking at the resurrection and empty tomb. So we know, all right, it's highly likely from all evidence that Christ, in fact, died on the cross. Now what happens? We see Joseph of Arimathea offering up his tomb. We know from extra biblical accounts and even a reference in Acts, this idea that there was a guard posted. Paul says this is the key concept of Christianity, the resurrection. The earliest witnesses, and especially women, and this is highly relevant since women could not legally testify in court at the time. This would not have been your most likely story if you were making something up. You would have instead taken a much more credible legal figure, if you will, maybe even Joseph of Arimathea himself, discovering the empty tomb. And we also have the Apostles' Creed, and we'll look at that in a little bit, but all of these first-hand witness accounts, all of the early extra-biblical accounts indicate that the tomb was empty on the third day. Mark's account as the gospel was likely the earliest. There is some issues in the Julian calendar dating, so there's some debate between 28 and 33 AD. It's the exact date of Christ's crucifixion due to some rounding issues and later adjustments. I generally hold it was probably between 30 and 33, depending on whether you consider they got it right the year of his birth or the year of his death backwards. But I think Mark was likely dated somewhere between about 38 and 44 AD, so 5 to 10 years later at the most. At first century terms, that's super early. Most of the Greek history was hundreds of years later. Yeah.
Just a question, because they say, well, the disciples stole the body.
Mm-hmm.
What would they have done with this body? And who could have kept this where it was? I don't
Yeah.
know. People don't keep secrets.
I mean, I'm sure they could have figured out somewhere to have reburied the body, I suppose, to disguise it. But why, I think, is the bigger question, and to what ends. And generally, if you look at, criminal circles, if you have 3 people involved, somebody's cracking. If you have 12 or 20 or 500, somebody's really cracking.
We saw Peter's example,
Yeah.
He was,
Yeah.
he cracked
Mhm.
under the pressure.
Yes.
There would have been tremendous pressure.
Mm-hmm.
To,
Yeah.
where did
Yeah.
what did she do?
Mm-hmm.
Where is
And then Paul, as a guy who was persecuting the church, something unique and distinctive happened that convinced him that he had seen the risen Christ in a way that compelled him to completely turn about, to risk imprisonment, beatings, shipwrecks. I mean, not a very happy, time in the spread of the gospel. So I think that's why most modern scholars have abandoned that theory. It doesn't hold up, from the evidence or even the psychology involved, because you would have had to have somehow had some very small subset of people involved that kept that secret even to death. And then I think you'd have a very huge problem, because if you look at other cults and even other contemporary religions, the Greek and Roman gods, no one even takes those seriously anymore. It's not even a discussion as a major world religion. So kind of the contemporary evidence would be, without real power behind it, what keeps it going? There were guards at the tomb. There's some debate whether these were the temple guards or the Roman guards. Either or would have had a very high commitment to making sure nobody messed with that body. And so I think, there were, again, some of the apocryphal writings that argue that the guards were bribed or fell asleep. It's a little hard to buy that, any reasonable guard regiment that you're somehow rolling this massive stone away from a tomb, getting the body out and getting it somewhere you can dispose of it all in a fairly short order. Yes. Mm. Yeah, Roman guards would have been executed for the failure of duty. Falling asleep at post would have been a capital crime. The temple guards, maybe not. Yeah. There was a group of the temple guards that were Roman assigned legionnaires under the control of the high priest, but there were also Jewish guards. They would have been unlikely to have been the ones assigned to tomb duty because they would have been for protecting the offerings and the sacred spaces of the temple. They usually didn't leave. It's commonly believed the guards that arrested Christ were Roman on assignment. So the logical piece would be that the guards that would have been at the tomb would have been Roman soldiers as well.
How many it would take to move?
Yeah.
It would take a lot.
Yeah. I mean, these were usually multi-ton stones. Typically, it was sloped down so that the stone would stay in place. Again, not having the exact tomb definitively. We don't know the exact physical makeup, but usually the entrance holes weren't real big because they were hand carved into rock. So it's not like you got 6 guys straight across and you just picked up and left with whatever either. Probably a little bit of noise, stone on stone grinding away. I mean, it gets pretty implausible, and I think that's why modern historians have rejected that particular theory as well as the swoon theory, because the guy who'd been beaten nearly to death but somehow just barely survived isn't rolling that stone away on his own, let alone getting past the guard. So, some of the older critiques have kind of failed, I think, in the eyes even of pretty hardened atheists. And the more contemporary debate is, was it bodily resurrection or was it some version of a spirit that they'd seen? The tomb site was definitely known by the Jewish leaders and the early Christians. I mean, there would have been no mystery where it was. And so, okay, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, somebody might have gone and checked this out and gone, no, the body's still in there, the tomb's full. And that would have been the end of the debate real fast. And ultimately, I look at the Old Testament as this build-up or groundwork for this ultimate sacrifice coming. There is a promise of a Messiah. I think some of the Jewish leaders mixed up the first coming of Christ through humility and sacrifice with the second coming of Christ as a conquering king, and every knee shall bow and every tongue confess. And they expected this king-style person rather than a humble Messiah sacrificing himself. But I think there's some pretty clear passages through Scripture, this idea, including right at the curse of Genesis. Through one man, Adam, sin enters the world, so shall one man, the Son of Man, sin be resolved or exit. The sacrificial lamb that David talked about, the looking forward of even the Levitical code to an ultimate sacrifice, a restoration without sin. There were plenty of passages that lay this basis that I don't believe any of the other false messiahs of history have ever met that litmus test. It's also interesting to me, like, the Quran, okay, there you go, the swoon theory, but they also say that Jesus was born from virgin birth and was without sin, but he's only a prophet. If you grant me virgin birth and sinless, I'm going, that's pretty different. Even Muhammad doesn't meet those criterion, so I'm going to go, that's something extraordinary at minimum. The Jewish leadership even recognized the apostles later. The critique was, who was these guys rabbis, these nobodies? How do they speak with such authority and understand Scripture so well? The event of Pentecost and 5,000 people coming to faith at once in a culture that would have been predisposed to reject the gospel under penalty of death potentially. That's pretty significant. That would be a really large gathering in Jerusalem. it would be a very high percentage of any likely gathering at the temple in midweek. You know, if you give any credence to that story, you say, okay, something radically and miraculously transpired, not just at the resurrection of Christ, but in the descent of the Holy Spirit into the first century church. You know, and I want to talk about some of these eyewitness accounts, because if we were holding a trial, you know, generally 2-3 eyewitnesses, you'd start going, that's probably what happened. You know, Paul, you know, again, as a persecutor of Christianity, said he appeared to him. James, the half-brother, and became a Christian as a result of that appearance. Jude isn't as explicit that Christ had appeared to him, but obviously did become a Christian, wrote Jude, died for his faith. You know, we see Peter, to your point earlier, Peter buckled. I mean, again, if we're writing the story of great mythology, we're not having him betray Christ 3 times. Let's start there. We certainly then don't take that persona and go, okay, you're in. You're facing up against all comers and defying all orders to cease preaching the gospel, and imprisonments and beatings and all the fun things that happened to Peter, ultimately to his martyrdom. The 12, and then 500 at one time. And this was a early oral teaching, because Paul references it again in 1 Corinthians 15. He had heard this repetition. I think it's part of these early oral teachings that Mark and others extrapolate from. I also find it interesting, these earliest accounts were written in Aramaic, which did start phasing out of popularity post the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So it would logically, unless we're going to write in dead languages these stories for popular consumption, it would have logically been predating that date. Probably all the gospel accounts, given the language usage. You know, Paul's first letter to the Corinthians talks about his account or referencing that when he'd visited them in 51 AD, he talked about this. So again, within 20 years, Paul had not only converted, but had gone on missionary journeys and had been telling the same concept. Luke was a Gentile and a physician, and he very clearly in Luke 1-4 says, I'm describing this as a historical account. I'm taking extra care. I've done the research. I've talked to the eyewitnesses. I'm very committed to making sure this is an accurate recounting of what happened. One might say that precursor assumes he's intending to be historical. Okay.
Can we backtrack a
Yeah.
little bit to the earliest accounts are
Yes.
in Aramaic?
Mm-hmm.
I've got in the back of my mind that the New Testament was written in Greek. What's my confusion?
The most common translations we have today were Greek, but the original documents from papyrus fragments were Aramaic. And that would have been the predominant language of Israel at the time. Greek took over as the Roman authorities kind of clamped down, and it was particularly post the fall of 70 AD when the Romans said, okay, we've had enough of these Maccabean revolutions, you know, we're putting an end to it. But that's another case where I think Mark dates much earlier than some traditions, because he references the Maccabean revolt, which would have predated mid-50s when the second Maccabean revolt occurred. Be like someone writing right after World War I, but before World War II, the Great War. If it's post-World War II, then it's World War I or World War II as your reference marks, not the Great War. And so I think those are other compelling reasons to me that the dating is textually likely to be relatively early in the cycle. All of the apostles other than John, who was exiled to Patmos, died as standing for their faith and saying they would not recant or offer idols, incense, or a variety of other conditions that caused their death. But basically that Christ was risen and was the only Son of God and the only way to heaven. That was a consistent theme of the reasons of the death of the apostles. And I think at the end of the day, it has to be more than just legends or hallucinations, as some have suggested, not least of which because it was completely opposite what was expected at the time. You know, I think even some near-death accounts, sometimes you could explain, all right, you were predisposed to believe in a heaven. the Jewish tradition of the time was not predisposed to assume a resurrected Messiah. That was not the common teachings and beliefs, and quite frankly, a big part of why the religious leaders just rejected Christ. It didn't fit the profile of what was supposed to happen. You know, when they were thinking Line of David, they were thinking king, not born in some backwoods town to nobodies. That was absolutely not part of their equation of thought. Okay.
I'm thinking that well, it's not the original thought with me, but it certainly makes sense, that the Old Testament prophecies about Jesus being the Messiah,
Mm-hmm.
they're fairly cryptic,
Mm-hmm.
because otherwise it seems that,
Yeah.
well, it might be an idiot, but it's a pretty
Mm-hmm.
smart guy, and as are other divine beings who are more with the Savior, but they would have been able to figure this out if it hadn't been cryptic. And then the debate is,
Yeah.
would they have seen Jesus? They probably would not have had Christ crucified,
Mm-hmm.
because they would realize that, well, that is the beginning of the end for us. Or maybe they had it figured out and thought, well, we can beat him anyways.
I mean, there's certainly been plenty of historic cases where a unknown heir of a royal line was discovered and the existing ruling force had them executed. You know, you can look through Russian, English history and a few other countries that happened. So you can't necessarily presuppose that even if you knew with certainty that your human corruption doesn't cause a bad outcome. Yes, you're right, but I think there was both. There is the beaten and pierced for their transgressions, and there is the triumphant return of a king. So both are true of prophecy. I don't want to fault the early leaders for missing it, because I think it's easy in hindsight. It's just like for Abraham, it's easy for us to go, okay, yeah, sure, you're going to sacrifice your son. Well, that's not so easy firsthand when you've never seen a resurrection before. You've waited 25 years for a promise. This isn't easy in the first person. And I think that's the other reason I think the apostles dying for this faith is so significant, because they were putting it all on the line. And obviously Paul himself said, you know, to die is gain, but to live is Christ. I mean, he was ready and prepared for that event. But it didn't make it easy at the time, and especially some of the ways early Christians were executed was brutal. I mean, getting torn apart by wild animals or lit on fire does not seem to be my preferred method. If I get a choice in the things that God can kill me with, I'd like massive heart attack in the sleep, not burned alive. But that's God's sovereignty. But certainly willfully saying, I will go into that to stand for this truth is significant. I also want to look at some extra biblical accounts to further round this out. Ignatius was a disciple of John, so he would have heard firsthand and spent time with him. He was appointed as the third bishop of Antioch after the other two were killed, Peter and Avidius. This was in 66 AD, so again, 30-ish years after the resurrection of Christ. This was his testimony. He wrote 7 letters to churches and people and was martyred for his belief. So he believed that John's account was so compelling, and we don't know definitively if he had seen the risen Christ himself. Given geography, unlikely, but he certainly believed it based on his experience and the accounts that he had been given. Polycarp, he was a Christian bishop in Samaria. He had written letters to the Philippians and was martyred for his belief, but he articulated this idea of a resurrection. Clement was a disciple of Peter. He may have, given timing, been exposed pretty early to a lot of witnesses. We're not sure. But he was Bishop of Rome by 88. He was ultimately banished from Rome to go work in a rock quarry, and common belief is he was martyred there. So you've got 3 early church leaders or fathers that all held to this idea as direct disciples of firsthand witnesses. So they believed it at some compelling level, had some experience of Christ themselves, obviously had a certain level of maturity in their faith to have been appointed as leaders in the church. And this idea of the Didache, the Lord's teaching through the 12 apostles to the nations as a full, and that was in Koinonia Greek. So by that time, some of the writing had shifted. Generally the dating is probably between 50 and 60 AD, given the way it was distributed to the other countries. And it was a very simplistic teaching. It's 2,000-ish words. It's, a handful of pages long. It's very similar in context to the Apostles' Creed, a little more fleshed out. But that was one of those extra biblical accounts that had the consistency of Scripture, would have been very likely the summary of the oral tradition that was passed on as Peter and Paul and others went on their missionary journeys to other places. And ultimately there were some critics. There was 2 Greek philosophers who were very opposed, Celsus and Porphyry. Both of these guys wrote explicit letters critiquing the church and mocking Christians. They had knowledge of the gospel accounts and whatever the witnesses were. They both acknowledge that there was the belief by Christians of a resurrected Christ. They thought it was foolish, but it's pretty compelling evidence very, very early on. If you have a critique of something, it obviously has existed long enough to get to you and you've become mad about it. And this is before the age of the internet, so it took a little while. When things had to be hand copied and passed around, it wasn't instantaneous communication, and that's important to realize that if guys in Greece, not even necessarily at the core of Rome, are writing about it, it's reached kind of the proverbial end of the Roman roads network. The topic of the resurrection of the Messiah in the Old Testament is thin. Val? Oh. Yes. But the accounts, as we're going to see in the Old Testament, of a resurrection concept is pretty sparse. And I give great latitude to the Jewish leaders not immediately jumping to that conclusion. And the verses I at least can find are Psalm 16:10 of, do not abandon my soul to Sheol or hell. That Isaiah 53 is talking about this justification of sin through a sacrifice. Daniel 12 specifically says a resurrection to an everlasting life, but it's more broadly, so it could be very well interpreted as the final resurrection at Christ's second coming. Both Jonah and Hosea talk about raised up on a third day, Jonah more metaphorically, Hosea a little more particularly, but I think it's thin. And so I understand why maybe even post-resurrection some of the Jewish leaders still didn't go, oh, okay, now I get it. Where obviously the first century church did expand and grow and transform lives, and lots of witnesses, both firsthand and secondhand, continued to go and give testimony.
So, do you think this goes into the whole concept of the stumbling block for the Jews? The Lord's intention?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to draw too broad a conclusion.
Yeah, I think obviously the bulk of first and second century Christians were Jewish, so I think there was a group that got it. I think religious elite throughout history have made decisions around power, unfortunately, sometimes over God. And without getting into too many specifics, I think you guys can probably all think of a few examples. There's plenty of modern day examples of leaders in the church that got their egos involved in something and made a series of unwise choices. Whether that ended up in adultery or just getting caught in some transaction that didn't quite look right or whatever, it still happens. And so I think it's really, and Scripture is pretty clear around this, we need to approach God humbly, and I think it's for our own benefit. There is a place where there's a God and we're not it, and if we presume this holy creator of the universe, yes, he calls us friends, yes, he calls us Christ, yes, we're members of the royal priesthood, but there still is God who is so infinitely powerful and righteous that we don't get to demand of God anything. It's one of the things I've always wrestled with Job, where God never even explains to him why it all happened. he gets whacked down a couple of times when he goes to God, what's happening? And he's like, well, did you make the ocean? Did you create the lamb? I mean, who are you to even ask? I'm like, that's not fair. His righteousness is why he was tested and sorted out. There's times God's not going to reveal to us the specifics. Clearly Christ knew. In the Garden of Gethsemane, I think it's very obvious that he understood what was coming. And again, it's this interesting character. Disciples fell asleep. They couldn't even stay awake. And so, what in the world transferred between guys who can't even stay awake or deny Christ to, I'm ready to die brutal, savage death for this? Something radically different transpired. And today, if you read books or newsletters like Voice of the Martyrs, you see some modern day accounts that are pretty savage of the ways that Christians are dying right now. And the kinds of accounts that are given where they go, you can kill me, but I'm not recanting, I'm not changing my view. And so we've talked a little bit about this, but motivations, if we say that the reasonable belief is the records that we have were accurate records of what the disciples said, why might they be inaccurate? Why would they have somehow been different than reality? I think one that has been postulated on and off was they were deceived or hallucinated. That somehow they'd had some compelling enough hallucination that convinced them. As we discussed previously, I think part of the problem I have with that argument, its face, is if your preconceived notion is based on the Jewish faith of the first century, you did not presume this was going to be a resurrection event. That would have been probably the last thing you would have likely assumed. And I think why the disciples all bolted at the death of Christ and went into hiding was not that they expected him to triumphantly return. In fact, some of the earlier accounts show disciples didn't even believe the women when they came back and said the tomb's empty. They had to go run and see for themselves. They were religious zealots. That's not what we have historically recorded. It's not even what the critique of the disciples were. These were fishermen and tradesmen and very ordinary people. These were not people in great rabbinical tracts with education. Saul, who became Paul, certainly was. But the original 12 were fundamentally nobodies in Jewish tradition. They were lying intentionally. It was the great deception. Why? Why would you die for a lie? But two, what did you have to gain? But a life of misery and suffering is pretty much what disciples got. We never see any reference that these guys accumulated any material wealth. Most of them couldn't even stay in one place very long. Maybe it was God's Spirit, but a lot of it was being driven out. Obviously Paul was beaten, shipwrecked, imprisoned multiple times. Peter was imprisoned. It's pretty clear that this wasn't going according to whatever master plan would have reasonably been true. Hey, guys, let's all conspire this grand, hoax. Most historic hoax have been for power, money, or fame. I guess technically they may have gotten fame later. They certainly didn't get fame at the time. They definitely didn't seem to get any power or money out of it. There's no account that describes that. And in fact, really until Constantine in 325, the entire world was opposed against them, literally. There's this illusion that the church that exists today somehow represents the first century church. It does not. We aren't encountering the kind of persecution that existed for the first 3 centuries, where the entire government religious structure at the time was opposed. Both the Jewish leaders and the Roman leaders wanted nothing to do with this, and were absolutely committed to stamping it out. And the final one, and it still exists in some circles, is this idea that Jesus was somehow this vision or specter or ghost or whatever. It wasn't a bodily resurrection. Paul's pretty particular in 1 Corinthians 15. If the body didn't raise, then what hope do we have in our flesh for resurrection? He's pretty particular about this. And he may have been the only one that didn't see the resurrected body of Christ. It may have actually been a vision for him. But he was so convinced in talking to Peter and others that there was a bodily resurrection of Christ that it changed forever his approach to life. And said it's fundamentally necessary for us to have hope in a bodily resurrection, that Christ modeled that.
Yeah, Thomas makes it pretty clear.
Yeah, put my hands and the wounds, and Jesus says, go for it. I mean, if you're doing this thing, like what's out there, you're probably not quite convinced enough. Now, there are other Christian scholars who say even that's sufficient. You grant me a talking spirit that interacts and communicates with me and appears, that's still some reasonable level of extraordinary evidence. I think Paul's right. I think the bodily resurrection is unique and important because in Jewish tradition of sacrifice, the sacrifice died, the blood was put on the altar, and that was that. None of the animals came back to life. And so I think there is that importance. And I think it's to ignore some of the earlier gospel accounts of Lazarus and the girl, I'm forgetting her name now, that had died, that he came and called her to get up, and the one other person in the crowd. Those were physical resurrections by the accounts of the Gospels. Now, those don't hinge our entire faith, but I think they're precursors. And it is interesting that the disciples didn't translate that, given their firsthand witness of some of those events. But it is what it is. They were confused, and then they were not confused. It's very clear to me that whatever their shortcomings were prior to the resurrection of Christ, they all went away after that. There was no threat that could contain them that would stop them from preaching the gospel to their last breath.
Also, the New Testament is continually revealing God as a God of life. And those that the ancients who participated in other societies, other gods, they knew their gods were the God of death. And so the ultimate revelation that God was the God of life would have been the resurrection of a body. To me, it doesn't make sense if you're the God of life that you can't do this.
Well, I think you absolutely can. I think the counter argument to that would be God of creation would meet the definition of God of life. He created all life.
This would have been the sacrifice that came
Yes, this would have been the ultimate, and I think that would be the affirming place, and why God chose to do it was to demonstrate this is that ultimate final sacrifice. Now, obviously, I also find it somewhat ironic after the temple's destruction in 70 AD, to this day, the Jewish religious establishment has no place for sacrifice. And so now you've had thousands of years without even the ability of sacrifice, which is interesting. If God wanted that to continue, wouldn't he have provided some provision for it? Unfortunately, for them, that doesn't exist today, which, again, to me is further indication where God said, we're done with that season. We're on to something else. And so I think in summary, there is reasonable evidence for a resurrection. Can I say it proves it beyond any shadow of doubt? Of course not. But I think that it is the most reasonable explanation given all historic and extra-biblical references, the way it spread, the number of manuscripts we have, very early dated, that all say similar things. Some try and critique where, the gospel accounts have different stories or slightly different accounts of who was where. They all say the basic same story. Christ was crucified and rose from the dead. And then even the Pauline epistles and James and Jude all affirm this idea. The necessity of the risen Christ is fundamental and central to the value of Christianity. In my opinion, I think Easter should actually be the higher holy holiday than Christmas, because I think it's the conclusion of the promise of God that gives us hope. And I think it's interesting where modern scholarship's really moved away from some of the more primitive critiques and has now had to wrestle with, okay, empty tomb, what do I do with that? Similar as we will look at some of the arguments of creation or creator, modern science is moving rapidly away from the Big Bang theory because the math and science doesn't support it anymore. There's a lot of movement towards quantum level and string theory and other options because the hypothesis doesn't hold up in the weight of the evidence we now know. And I think likewise, as we have continued to discover very early papyrus records and, a few stone etchings here and there, but places that are geographically remote enough in proximity time-wise that you can't ascribe it to legend anymore. This was the account likely given. Now you can say that, again, disciples were lying or deceived or whatever, but you do pretty well have to conclude this is at least what they told others. And like in a criminal trial, at what point do the number of witnesses kind of overtake whatever reasonable doubt might be? Okay.
Maybe the most preeminent Greek scholar who's not a believer would be Bart Ehrman.
Mm-hmm.
And even he says
Yes.
some people just read what is presupposed,
Mhm.
what he says means something else. But at any rate, the long and the short of it is he believes that Jesus was an actual living being,
Mhm.
and he just does not ascribe Godhead.
Yes.
And somewhere along the line, Bart was injured somewhere.
Yeah. And my more recent viewing of some of his video content, I think he ascribes to this idea of a risen Christ in something other than a corporeal or earthly fashion, which is an interesting place to go as a defense.
Yeah, if he went that way, I would think he would want to sign up, right? And I don't know how he would use it for a defense against, or an argument against.
I've heard a couple of scholars talk about that the evidence is reasonably compelling, but at the end of the day, it still takes a step of faith to discover its truth. And you have to be willing. I think, you talk about this appearance to 500, and again, heavily influenced by first century Jewish belief. It'd almost be like having a Democrat or Republican rally today and having 500 people convert to the other party. Sadly, I don't think we're in that culture and time today. And I guarantee you the established Jewish thought was at least as deeply ingrained as that. And so something radically different transpired to create that outcome. At the end of the day, and we'll see this a little bit in some of the arguments for creation, there are several leading atheists who say, yes, the evidence is compelling, but because I do not want to conclude that God was the answer, I'm going to reject it and believe something alternative. There was a great skeptic who became a Christian who titles a book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, because it, in some cases, requires more faith than one of creation. But I think it's this other concept probably is not relevant when discussing miracles. I mean, a lot of people say, well, it's exceptional, it's impossible, it's improbable, whatever. Well, that's the definition of a miracle. It defies normal physical laws and statistics. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a miracle. It'd be every other Tuesday. If I go down to the local restaurant and order a hamburger and they bring it to me, it's not a miracle. That's exactly cause and effect. I also find that it's interesting how many early critics of Christianity actually help validate, for me at least, the authenticity of the story. If you're going to give the account and then critique it, it means the account was well known enough that you thought it was worth addressing. To taking the time to write an entire manuscript critiquing it, you believe there was something going on around that. You were seeing the first-hand growth of the church, and you wanted to stop it in the case of some of the Greek philosophers, because it was opposed to their belief. And hopefully you've kind of gotten this picture that this whole story is totally outside of what first century expectations would have been. That this is like, we're going to pray that, purple elephants or dinosaurs appear on stage as proof of God's existence. It's totally outside of what any of us are probably praying for in our normal prayer life. That's not at all what comes to mind. And yet that's exactly what happened and in my experience in my own life, and I look at the way God has operated throughout history, he answers prayers consistently, but virtually never in the way that the person praying intended. You've heard me say before, he uses the ordinary items to accomplish the extraordinary things. Axe heads floating, lamps keep giving oil. Lots of these things that are completely different than we would expect. And I think it's reasonable to say the impact of Jesus on history is so much greater than any other first century person, it's not even close. Some would argue greater than any other person in history, period. But why? Why does some backwoods kid that has no formal education that we know of, carpenter by trade, probably scandalous, and a pregnancy outside of wedlock, how in the world does this transform to the figure that changes virtually all known recorded history? There has to be more than some grand conspiracy theory. I can point lots of cults throughout time that when the leader died, the cult ends. Very few even made it one generation. None I'm aware of made it to a second. And yet Christianity has continued to grow and change and evolve across countries over and over and over again. In fact, the places growing the fastest is where there's the most persecution, whereas the greatest risk of imprisonment or death is where the church is moving. And ultimately, I think that we as Christians have experienced the living God, and in many cases seen miracles. That I have seen them firsthand. I have no doubt that God has operated in miraculous ways in my life and the life of people that are close to me. I've seen him answer those things. I've seen where God's wanted other outcomes, where he's allowed suffering to continue for the betterment of myself and others. But I would also say that in my view of the contemporary church, God is still alive and operating, that Christ is a knowable component of God, that if people will even open the door, will crack the door open and say, okay, God, show me who you are. This is how we get guys like Lee Strobel. I'm going to prove my wife is wrong. I'm a Chicago journalist. I'm going to set out and prove this is ridiculous and show her. I gave you guys the case for Easter. It's a nice short version. He's got several others that are longer, but, here's a guy who is committed to making a mockery of Christianity, who it boomeranged. He kind of said, okay, I give up. The evidence is too compelling. My wife was right. And I could give you numerous other contemporary scholars that have done the same thing. When they've set out to prove how ridiculous Christianity was, they ultimately had to come to faith because the evidence was too compelling. Or even some, just contemporary authors who have simply opened that door. God, reveal yourself to me. If you're real, show me. And have been authentic to those experiences. It's life-changing. And I think each of us has our own testimonies, the own ways that God got a hold of us. As we spend the next 4 weeks, hopefully giving you some tools to give context to your personal experience in a way that does draw upon philosophy and science and logic, and give some structure or framework that's compelling. I've had this discussion with a lot of folks who want to kind of take the intellectual route, and I say, look, I'll be very candid up front. I think I can prove to you that the arguments for God are at least as good as those against. At the end of the day, you still have to make a leap of faith. You'll still have to test it for yourself. That's what will be compelling at the end of the day. I can show you it's not foolish. I can show you there's reasonable belief. I think there's good causality to say, here is evidence of God. But if you choose to ignore it or reject it, it won't do any good for you. It's only when we embrace it, and even to the degrees that we embrace. I think God's always calling each of us. Are you willing to take the next step of faith, the next thing that's a little bit outside your comfort zone? Are you willing to do the next thing I'm asking you to do so that I can show up and work? And so as we move to discussion questions, we'll break up into groups. You can pick one or two of these, and we'll have about 15 minutes for discussion. The first one is, which of the arguments for Easter is most compelling to you? And you can talk about that in a group, and it's all right if you don't agree. Find one that you like and use it. When have you experienced God in the most concrete way, personally? If you were giving your testimony and you wanted to point to one thing, we know for the faith, the central thing is the resurrection. For you personally, what is that thing or place that God showed up? What miracles are you personally aware of or witnessed firsthand? And what would you say is a short summary of the evidence for the resurrection? If you were to distill down all of these into a cohesive, short, 1 minute or 30-second discussion, what would it look like? So we'll break up. You can pick whatever questions are there, and then we'll wrap up at the end.